So this is a very general unit. We're just going to talk about sort of what the characteristics of living things are, what they need to stay alive, and how do living things, how do species change over time? How do they evolve? Those are the topics that we're going to be covering here. So on this first slide, what you see is Charles Darwin. We'll learn about redwood tree and amoeba, whale, some giraffes, and some finches. We'll talk about all those things. All right, these are some definitions that you have that you can refer back to. We're actually going to skip ahead a couple slides here so we can move along. All right. So let me ask you this question. How would you recognize if something is alive? Or? If it moves, like a tree? Is it alive?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, so what else? Right? Oh, okay. Sure. Matthew?
It grows.
It grows? Okay. Tommy?
If it's made up of living cells.
Made of living cells, okay. Anything else?
If it's moisty in the inside.
If it's what?
Moisty in the inside.
Moist on the inside?
Because trees have water.
Okay. Never heard that one. All right. Anything else?
Human all.
A lot of people want to say if it has blood.
Trees don't have blood.
I know. But I'm just saying what lots of people say. All right, so you guys are on to a couple of them. So there are certain characteristics that all living things have. If it's alive, it has all 6 of these characteristics. And we'll list them first, and then we'll talk about them in more detail. So first, and probably most important, all living things are made of cells. So if it's alive, it is made of cells. All living things obtain and use energy in some way. All living things grow, and we said this, and develop over time. All living things respond to stimuli in their environment, or internal stimuli. All living things reproduce. And finally, all living things are adapted to their environment. So these are what we call the characteristics of living things. And if something is alive, it exhibits all 6 of these characteristics. Think about any living organism you can imagine and has those 6 characteristics. Some non-living things have 1 or 2 or 3 of those characteristics, but not all of them. All right, so let's talk about them in a little bit more detail. First one, cells. So we said all living things are made of cells. Now, some organisms are just a single cell. We say that cell is it's a basic unit of life. Sometimes we say the building blocks of life. And cells are generally tiny, microscopic structures – that help an organism do all the things it needs to function. Some organisms are one-celled, some are many-celled. For example, we have trillions of cells that make up our body, whereas an amoeba is just a single cell. But both are alive. So all living things are made of cells, at least one, often more than one. All living things must obtain and use energy. And energy comes from an organism's environment. Where does your energy that you use to write your notes right now, which require energy to work the muscles in your hands and arms? Where do you obtain energy, Laura? From eating food. In the process that takes the foods that we eat and actually gets usable energy out of them is called metabolism. And if you think about how we use energy, you can sort of split it into stages. And those stages are listed there. First one being ingestion. What does that mean? Ingestion. Out of it?
When you actually are eating it?
Yeah, the process of taking in food. Eating. So say this morning you are ingested a bowl of Fruity Pebbles. Did anybody ingest any Fruity Pebbles this morning? No?
Yogurt.
No?
Chocolate yogurt.
Bologna toast? What is that?
Ramen.
That sounds gross.
I ate
It's supposed to have.
All right, so
Yeah, you are.
let's say Shane together. Shane ingested some bologna toast this morning. It's a new food I've never heard of, but all right. I understand. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. All right. Wow. Maybe that's on the school lunch menu this week.
We discussed
Sorry, no bologna toast today. Hello.
No bologna toast.
Yeah. Okay.
It's recording
I'll tell you have something in the attendance when class is over. All right. So ingestion is eating the food. So then, okay, well, for Shane to be writing his notes now, he needs some of that energy from that bologna toast. So, how does that energy get to the muscles in his arm? Are little chunks of bologna currently floating through Shane's veins and arteries, going to his cells?
No.
Little bits of toast? No.
Yogurt.
What's happening? Yeah?
The body, his body takes in bologna toast. It uses it to keep that feel it.
Okay. What actually happened? So he chewed up his bologna toast. What happened to it, Shane?
The body took all the nutrients that it needed from it and broke it down and sent it to him.
Yeah.
Digested it.
Yeah, so digestion. Digestion is taking pieces of bologna and actually breaking them down into very simple forms that your body can actually use. So, bologna would get broken down. Bologna is some sort of strange meat product made out of various meats that we don't know about. But anyway, they would get broken down. Meat is mainly made of what?
Protein.
Protein. And so in your digestive system, to digest that protein, it gets broken up into tiny little amino acids. The starch in the bread gets broken down into simple sugars by enzymes and acids in our digestive system. And those simple molecules are what actually gets delivered to our cells. Okay? All right, once those molecules do get to our cells, okay, then the next step can happen, respiration. Respiration is taking these simple molecules and actually getting some usable energy out of them. All the cells in our body have to go through this process of respiration. And you're going to have to learn the details of it in a future unit, in the next unit. But For now, all you need to know is that it takes simple molecules and actually extracts the energy. But part of this process generates some waste products. Respiration generates carbon dioxide. Okay, the breakdown of material and the breakdown of proteins generates nitrogen wastes. Things that, if they were to build up in our body, would become toxic, would become dangerous. And so the last step, excretion, means to do what?
Carry out waste.
Yeah, to remove waste from the body. Okay, so how do we get rid of the carbon dioxide?
Breathe.
By exhaling.
John.
How do we get rid of nitrogen waste?
Go to the bathroom.
Urine.
Through your kidneys, through producing urine, is that waste, okay, mixed with water to be released from the body. Okay, because those wastes could build up and become dangerous. So those are the steps in metabolism: taking foods, extracting energy, okay, so that our cells can actually use. Okay. Good. All right. So all living things are made of cells. All living things have to obtain and use energy. Next step, stimulus and response. So, all living things respond to various factors in their environment. Okay? A stimulus is some sort of change in the environment. A change in temperature, a visual change in the chemical. And a response is the organism's reaction to that. So all living things go through this process of response to stimuli. Okay. Okay. So for example, if I make a loud noise in the back of the room, that's a stimulus. And what is your response?
We turn around and look at the
Turn around.
Or scream a
You
little.
could have been startled. So the loud noise is a stimulus, and you jumping or being startled is a response.
Oh, I get it. I'm getting this.
Have a wonderful day, students.
I'll be Bible school.
All of it. Thomas Small always knows what to say.
Okay, growth and development. Living things, over time, they grow and develop. What's the difference between those two things? What's the difference between growth and development? Shane?
Oh, to grow is like to get bigger, but develop is like. I had how it's.
Yeah, you just lost it. Yeah, you're on the right track. Growth is a change in size, whereas development is more of a change in structure. For example, if you think about a caterpillar changing into a butterfly, that is development. If you think about a snake just growing larger, that would be growth. So living things grow and develop over time. Tadpole changing into a frog, that's development, changing structure. All right, last two, reproduction and adaptation. So, living things, excuse me, living things reproduce, and reproduction is necessary for a species to continue living. Okay, if a species cannot reproduce, what happens to it?
It died.
It becomes extinct. Okay, so reproduction is basically just the creation of new organisms. Question, Donovan?
Yeah, how is that not spontaneous generation then?
Spontaneous generation is living things coming from non-living.
So that's.
Reproduction is living things coming from other living things. Okay, and we'll talk about the details of reproduction eventually, but for now we'll just define, there's two main types of reproduction when we think about living organisms. Asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And there's some differences that are important. In asexual reproduction generally happens in many simple organisms, simpler living things, things like bacteria, an amoeba, plants. But can happen also in some animals. In asexual reproduction, only a single parent organism is involved. And so really asexual reproduction is basically an organism making a copy of itself and reproducing in that way. And an important thing to note is that the offspring that are produced by asexual reproduction are identical to the parent. There's no variation. Does anybody have a garden at home? Anyone grow tomatoes this summer? Alright, so if you have a tomato plant growing in your yard and it gave you like awesome tomatoes, they're perfect. No diseases affected them, they're big, juicy, they taste great. So if you want more of those tomatoes, you could actually take a cutting of that tomato plant. Cut off a little part of a branch. Put that in some water or sand or soil, and that will start to grow into its own tomato plant. That tomato plant is reproduced. But that new tomato plant that you grow is going to be exactly the same as the original. That's a form of asexual reproduction. It's going to just be a copy of the original. It's probably going to give you the same great tomatoes that you had on the other plant. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves two parents mixing their genetic traits. And because there's the mixing of genes and DNA from two different parents, what do you think the offspring are like? Donovan?
A mix of the two parents?
Yeah, there's variation. Okay, so there's variation. The offspring are not identical to either parent. They have probably some combination of traits. So, lots of different species reproduce sexually, including plants. Plants can reproduce sexually as well. Animals, some protists, and so on. But sexual reproduction introduces variation into the species. Now, important thing to keep in mind is that we say this is a characteristic of life. But it's not a necessary characteristic for one individual to survive. Right? A person can grow into their old age and never reproduce and still be alive. But it is necessary for, what do you think we're going to say?
Species?
For the species to survive. Okay, and our last characteristic of life, adaptation. Now, you have to be very careful here. We're going to be talking about natural selection and evolution, but we say that living organisms are adapted to their environment. But we don't say living organisms adapt to their environment. It may sound like a small difference, but it's important. Why is that difference important? Why should we say species are adapted to their environment and not species adapt to their environment? Laura?
Because like wherever they already know like their surroundings aren't ideal, but if they're placed somehow
Exactly. If I take a polar bear, is a polar bear adapted to life in the Arctic?
Yes.
Yes, the species is. But if I take a group of polar bears and move them to the desert, are they going to adapt to life in the desert and all of a sudden have thin fur and ways of dealing with the heat? No. So they don't adapt to a new environment. They are adapted through the process of evolution from natural selection. All right, that's it.